So my talk intends to focus on the implications for psychotherapy practice, and particularly from a psychophysiological and psychodynamic perspectives. My hope is to get us to think about and consider depth psychological dimension of adapting therapeutic practice and settings. Alfred Breitz yesterday, during one of our meetings on the EAP board, said there is no more psychotherapy in the Ukraine. And not long after, he had to end the Zoom session and depart into a shelter because the air sirens, the bomb alarm went on. So adaptation means we need to work to contexts, both immediate and broad situational context. So if you're in the Ukraine right now, or trying to support refugees from the war, people fleeing from the war in the Ukraine, of which there are many, I think at the moment it's about 2 million, it's unimaginable. You should be thinking about crisis intervention, not about therapy. And this is not the topic we're doing today. I'm going now to screen share, actually, if I can get this to work. So, where are we? There, yes, okay. Okay, so this is the intro slide, and then we move on. So today I'm not going to be talking about crisis intervention because that's not the subject, but I have published a paper. Oops, where do we are? Yeah, here. I have published a paper on crisis intervention in 2020, and the publisher Taylor and Francis have made this kindly available for free download. I will show the slide again at the end, and you will also find it with the Congress material that will be sent to you afterwards. Or you can just go to my website and there's a link there and you can download it. Because this is too big a subject to include here in a minor way. Okay, so but I don't want to exclude it. So when we talk about adaptation, we very much need to include these sort of aspects of the psychotherapy field, the broader field. But maybe I should just say a few words, the distinction between crisis intervention and psychotherapy. So a crisis is something that happens right here, right now. So there is no safe space. There is not a possibility to have a safe space in the therapy room because the crisis is actually happening right now, just like it's going on in the Ukraine right now, or refugees who may be worrying about relatives, friends, partners, children, who are left behind. A lot of, I'm hearing men are not allowed, or certain men of a certain age are not allowed to cross the border, to have to stay behind and support the war, support the defense against Putin's troops. So a crisis is in the here and now, and we should not then aim to open this up as we do in psychotherapy. We need to kind of contain, we need to hold, we need to support people, we need to enable resources. First of all, identify resources they already have and support them. So you can read more about this in my paper, okay? And you can contact me if you have specific questions or so. But this is not the main subject today. So let me move on and back to the other chair, okay, for lack of a better word. So this, how this couch changed everything was a BBC headline in 2015. And some of you, I don't know how many of you have had a chance to go to the Freud Museum in London. This is where this couch is located. Now, when we look at this couch, on the one hand, it suggests safety, containment, and it's a predictable space. But on another level, when we come from a more contemporary psychophysiological dimension, then it is also a horizontal space. Now, for some of you, that may mean nothing, but I'm not sure if this was intuitive by Freud, or if he was aware of this. I'm not aware that he wrote about it. But when I struggle to access feelings, I said, I'm not sure what I feel. I don't know what's going on. I'm very much in my cognitive self and in my head. The moment we go into the horizontal position, we have more access to feelings, to emotional states. And of course, also the shadow side, we can feel more overwhelmed and more flooded. So in which case, it's good to go into a vertical position, because in a vertical position, there is more autonomy. It's a more dynamic position. I can react and move. Yeah. So this is where a lot of what we do today started. Okay, but we have, expanded our perspectives on what we see. Like I said, I'm not sure if Freud was aware of these horizontal dynamics. Yeah? So my question is, would Freud even recognize the psychotherapy field today? Because very clearly it has changed an awful lot since he was with us. Now, we can go a step further, and should we be concerned or should we be anxious about these changes? That how psychotherapy, has actually moved on, and probably today looks very different than what it looked like in the 1930s. And but at the same time, one could argue that psychotherapy is all about change, right? That's the whole point, that we want to enable people to move on and have more vitality and be able to, function better, and manage whatever brings them to psychotherapy in the first place. So if psychotherapy is essentially about change, should we really exclude the traditional setting from such truism? Should we make an exception? So everything can change, but not where and how we work. So I've chosen this slightly provocative image here. Or might we apply our psychotherapist's curiosity to explore non-conventional spaces for their depth psychological potential? Now, I quite like the word depth psychological. It's gone a bit out of fashion. Originally, when psychology denied that the unconscious existed, that's what it was 100 and something years ago, Breuer and other people came up with the term depth psychological to include the unconscious. And actually, it's a really good term. Ever since I came across this first, I've really liked it, so I'm using it. So where are we? So could we actually, we have since the pandemic and since Zoom started, there's been a lot of attention to boundaries. How do we make, video sessions safe, or other technologies, or outdoor therapy? But there hasn't been a lot of attention to the potential, the psychodynamic potential, what else is going on here, and how might this actually be relevant and could have potency, have therapeutic potency. So let me go on to, I had actually hoped we'd be able to use breakout rooms and have sort of a little break fairly soon now, but unfortunately, I learned that we cannot have, because the presidency already used the breakout system, we cannot use it here. So we have to improvise a little bit. Now, this image of this jar with the X is a sort of, some of you may have seen this. This is a common image used in organizational psychology when companies, corporations sort of explore change. And I'd like you all to take a minute and just sort of take this in, what this does in you. Is this something that's anxiety-provoking? Does this leave you cold? Is this perhaps exciting? What's going on in you right now? And you're certainly welcome to use the chat to share this. Like I said, we don't have breakout rooms because, there is always a personal, there's a personal way to engage with change. For some people, that's exciting. For some people, it's it's great, exciting. For some people, it provokes anxiety, provokes insecurity, or it simply leaves us indifferent. So, as a part of this, and in the theme of my talk, I would like you to use the chat to share if there is something particularly about, and let's not talk about Ukraine right now, okay, because that's obviously so extraordinary, but what is it about psychotherapy But you can certainly use polarization dynamics, for example. Yeah, what is it about these changes that are happening, you know, in to the context in which we work that concern you particularly? And then Barbara has kindly agreed to monitor the chat and let me know, yeah, if there's anything that I might be able to include here as we go forward. So that's the only way we can make this a little bit more participative today in the absence of breakout rooms. So yeah, please just check in how you feel when you see this image, when you see this jar slightly precarious on the edge of the table. Is it going to fall? Is it going to stay? Yeah. What's happening in you, particularly when you sit back and maybe take a breath, you know, just allow yourself to breathe and just see how what your response is. And from that place, then consider, you know, if there are any particular aspect of these changes that are happening around us, yeah, that you find particularly concerning. So while you do this, I sort of carry on a little bit. So last year, I gave a talk for the Lithuanian Psychological Society about working outdoors. This wasn't necessarily something I wanted to propagate particularly, but I was interested, how can we work with the formal frame, which is the psychoanalytic term for boundaries. So the formal frame includes everything from the meeting space, payments, cancellation, yeah, the whole setup that frames the psychotherapeutic endeavor. And maybe I should say a little more. One of my favorite definitions of psychotherapy is that we need a solid formal frame for both therapist and client or patient to freely cross psychological boundaries. That's what the formal frame is for. Yeah? So that both protagonists, or if it's a group, even more, can freely cross psychological boundaries. Not enact them, but explore them. I mean, Winnicott used transitional space. Yeah? So there have been various formulations to think about, yeah, these sort of dynamics. So, and then interestingly enough, as I prepared for this talk last year, I did a little search and what was there in terms of guidance, and I found a guidance document by the British Psychological Society, BPS, that was published in July 2020. And it was quite strange because instead of giving a guidance to how to manage that space and what challenges might be there and how to maintain the therapeutic space, it seemed to be just about how outdoor therapy is therapy light. So it's a way of staying in contact. Yeah? So this, yeah, the psychologist, psychotherapist, and the client patient go for a walk during session time to kind of maintain contact. But it didn't seem to take into account, you know, what we normally do in therapy. And I found that quite surprising, yeah, even shocking. So again, I'm not going into the detail. If you want to, there's a set of slides that was a handout. You can always email me. But so to me, it kind of got me more, yeah, saying, why aren't we talking about the psychodynamics? So my starting point here, in a way, is that I consider all meeting spaces as psychological spaces. So whether that's the telephone or Zoom or a walk in the park, yeah, or wherever we meet, it's a psychological space we meet in. And these psychological spaces have psychological properties and dynamics. And as psychotherapists, we should take them into account because that's what we do, right? So sometimes they may feel quite scary, yeah, these psychological spaces. And again, I'm going more into this. Yeah? What do we do when things, how do we manage that? How do we contain this when these psychological spaces feel a little scary? So, but, you know, we know that Zoom has brought and I'm using Zoom now. I mean, there's other platforms, VC, and yeah, I'm using Zoom as a generic term because it's become the best known for video psychotherapy. So I have a good example for it first, because there are so many people do things that they have never dared to do before, that they have been too inhibited or too, yeah, it wasn't possible there. Yeah. So a psychotherapist colleague who had gone back into therapy for support with current family illness a year before the start of the pandemic. To his surprise, his aging psychoanalyst was happy to continue on Zoom when the pandemic started. But then when he was even more surprised when he found himself, for the first time in his life, he had done lots of therapy. He's sort of close to my age. He's done lots of therapy in his life. For the first time in his life, he found himself lying on a couch with his analyst behind him on a laptop screen. Yeah, and for him, this was a breakthrough, yeah, because he had never even entertained the possibility. So Zoom is a place for firsts. Yeah? And there's many, I mean, from my supervision practice, which is mainly what I do these days, yeah? I hear lots of these stories, yeah, of things that happen because of Zoom. Yeah? So, yeah, again, where people just things that they previously refused or avoided. We have learned early on that online spaces can disinhibit people, so they lose inhibition. So that was one of the things we were all warned about when video therapy became more practical, because the technology worked better and better over the years. And I mean, I've never actually offered online therapy. I just want to clarify this. I have worked in all sorts of mediums over the years, for the last 20 years or longer, whenever there was a context, but not offering online therapy because supervisees live too far away, yeah, or a client moved from London to Morocco and wanted to continue therapy, things like this. So there is a downside, of course, yeah, where these disinhibitions can be quite concerning. And I mean, most of you will have read in the newspapers stories where people were breaking taboos in Zoom sessions, like in a business meeting, somebody was caught masturbating, okay, in a business meeting. So it seems a bizarre idea, but clearly these things have happened. And I think that's part of the disinhibition, which therapeutically can work good, but we also need to be mindful. Yeah? So for example, a psychotherapy client, yeah, was sitting not only in their bed, but under a duvet. Duvet is a bed cover, if those of you where English is not the first language. And in one instance, the client was frequently dressed in some Disney-themed pajama costume. Yeah, sort of something that children normally wear. It was an adult size. Yeah? So these examples for disinhibition may indicate some concerning degree of regressive enactment, but they cannot diminish any transformative or reparative potential associated with such psychological spaces. So we shouldn't be frightened of it, but obviously we need to respond, yeah, when there isn't enough adult in the space, as I would call it. Yeah? Normally we would say, when somebody's acting out and in a meeting in the same room, I would say something like, there is an adult who brings you here and takes you home. So I need some of that adult in the room in order to work with you. So that gets a little difficult, online, because, yes, there is an adult who switches on the computer, but so do children. Okay, so it's not so straightforward. So, but so those sort of concerns aside, there is a very rich potential here. So, for example, a long-running weekly psychotherapy group went online at the start of the pandemic. The group psychotherapists sought to replicate a previously established practice of retaining for a period of time an empty chair for group members who had left the group, in order to facilitate the group process around this person's leaving the group. To replicate the empty chair, the group therapist used an additional Zoom account. Yeah, and so there was an additional window on the Zoom screen of the group that showed an empty chair with the person's name on it. which was quite creative and, wonderful. But what happened next on one occasion, that one group member confessed to removing that Zoom window from his screen. Somehow he found the reminder of this person's leaving too challenging to, he didn't want to engage with. So he just swiped it. You can just swipe one of those windows away. But then he confessed to the group, and this stimulated a very lively group process. And of course, most likely this would have remained underground if they had met all together in one room. Because I don't imagine that a group psychotherapy group member will get up and take the chair out. That would be in the group itself. Whereas in the privacy of your own space, where you're looking at the screen, the temptation to just swipe and allow that impulse is, of course, much more tempting. So, but then again, the group was able to engage with this. So that's another example for me of how these kind of spaces can actually move. Sorry, okay, so it's a good example how it's not just a substitute. The meeting space, the psychological space in which we meet, is not just a substitute, but for a conventional consulting room, but in addition have potential to facilitate the co-creation of psychological spaces for otherwise hidden dynamics. In other words, Zoom and other non-conventional spaces have psychodynamic dimensions and values. And I think this is important to remember when we consider them. So this is another one, When you look at these two people on screen, distant, isolated, is a common association. Telephone is quite distant. Now, 20 years ago, somebody I worked with for about 10 years, all in all, who had family in Australia, would regularly go on trips to see the family. That usually 6 to 8 weeks, sometimes even longer. And we noticed over time how this person cut off from our therapeutic project whenever this happened. So we then agreed that the next time my client would go to Australia, we would continue to work via telephone. Internet wasn't suitable anyway. There was no video session. So we would use the telephone. Now, to my great surprise, it was quite extraordinary actually. The connection was pretty bad. It was quite chopped off. It's a long distance call, but the voice of my client in my ear was so close. I've never had a more intimate conversation on the telephone before or after. It was like it went right under my skin. And obviously this had to do with the attachment dynamics that were at work, the cutting off and then the non-cutting off, maintaining connection. But it was such a powerful example how this telephone line can be can be so effective rather than distancing or limiting but these ideas are not utterly new. I mean, David Boadella, my old teacher, he spoke of a coded condition when people, for example, when people used the telephone line, which in those days were fixed lines. So you needed actually a wire from telephone to telephone, no matter where it was, before the mobile phone. So he spoke of a coded condition where the telephone line became a sort of replacement or some form of symbol for the umbilical cord. So this was a conception from the 90s before we ever thought about many of these technologies. So let me just check time and okay. So all meeting contexts, virtual, telephone, or physical proximity present opportunities for subjective experiences of increased or decreased intimacy. So it's just worthwhile to pay attention. What's going on? What's actually happening right now, rather than interpret it or make assumptions. So now I'm coming to a sort of key aspect, which is therapist's vulnerability, which is something I've sort of gotten very interested in recent years, and it's become sort of in the foreground for me. So I'm using a different egg now. I like that egg better than the jar. So whenever we transcend the safety of the transitional consulting room, there might be anxious feelings about some aspects, for example. So what might happen, or am I doing it right, or will I be able to manage this, or yeah. So this is the time to connect with our vulnerability, and more so when we encounter polarized and fragmented psychological spaces, like for example around the war of Ukraine, and in Ukraine, and we had lots of this on the board in the last few days when we were trying to formulate statements and policy, yeah? And of course there's lots of different positions, and some of them sounded like, if you're not with us, you're against us, which is, you know, as polarized as you can get. So as therapists, when we meet this as therapists, fragmentation and polarization dynamics are highly contagious, and they will typically push us in the opposite polarity. They will typically diminish or overwhelm our psychophysiological anchoring capacity, so the therapist may become reactive or act out. Now, I want to say a little more about anchoring. So Damasio put it beautifully some years ago. We need a body to think and feel with. So we can't really separate parts of us. Yeah? So psychophysiological anchoring, as I call it, is an essential requirement for reflective, emotional, psychological processing of events and experiences. Peter Fonagy terms this mentalization. Dan Siegel uses high road processing. We're all talking about the same stuff, it's just different words. I prefer reflective, emotional, psychological processing. For me, that's more, you know, I don't know, makes more sense, okay? Now, anchoring is the image that I use often for myself, or when I talk about it, is a boat adrift. And if there's an anchor, yeah, then it feels very different. If you imagine yourself on a boat that's adrift on the ocean, and a boat that's anchored, yeah, it's still moving a little bit, but not too far. So you can call this containment, but anchoring is actually something that stabilizes me. Another great image I like is, I don't know if any of you remember Mark Twain's Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn book. It's a classic. When Tom Sawyer enters this labyrinth of a cave, as Mark Twain describes it, and he takes a string with him to find the way back. Again, that's a wonderful image for anchoring. So, and anchoring, so there are two parts to this. So when we get challenged, I'm just aware of time, so I'm moving a little faster. When we get challenged, two things happen in our psychobiology. At one point, at some stage, we get a hyper response, sometimes also fight, flight, freeze response. And on the other side, simultaneously, we have a hyper response when we shut something down. There's a numbing going on. Or as my friend Maria Horn-Brandberg calls it, between calm and collapse state. So one is accelerating in parts of our system, and the other one is inhibitory in a different part of our system, but simultaneously. We might be more aware of one or the other, depending who we are. So I'm not going to go more into the detail of this. I've spoken elsewhere about it, I've published on it. But the anchoring, so when I notice I'm losing myself, yeah, I'm not really, I can't feel my legs, for example, or I'm not really breathing anymore, or yeah, these sort of little signs that tells me that my anchoring is not very good. So there's two paths. One is psychological, personality, role. My job right now is to speak to you. That's my role at this Congress. So to kind of come back to my role. And the other one is to connect to my physical being in the world. That's breathing, respiration, grounding, movement. Both respiration and movement is voluntary and involuntary at the same time. So it's a very good way of, yeah? For example, lengthening your out breath, 2 in, 4 out. Yeah? Never mess around with the in breath, but the out breath can be lengthened. It will just, if you try this, it will just settle you down a bit more. Yeah? So, oops. There's some funny lines on my screen. Okay. So I don't know, maybe I just have time here for, because I've learned over the years that vulnerability doesn't seem to be a word that's so easily in some languages. So I will use a poem called Bluebird, which to my mind is, to me, it's the best definition of vulnerability, okay? So let me just read this to you. There's a bluebird in my heart that wants to get out, but I'm too tough for him. I say, stay in there. I'm not going to let anyone see you. There's a bluebird in my heart that wants to get out, but I pour whiskey on him and inhale cigarette smoke, and the whores and the bartenders and the grocery clerks never know that he's in there. There's a bluebird in my heart that wants to get out, but I'm too tough for him. I say, stay down. Do you want to mess up my book sales? Do you want to screw up the works? There's a bluebird in my heart that wants to get out, but I'm too clever. I only let him out at night sometimes when everybody is asleep. And I say, I know you're there, so don't be sad. And then I put him back, but he's singing a little in there. I haven't quite let him die. And we sleep together like that with our secret pact. And it's nice enough to make a man weep. But I don't weep, do you? So, I mean, it's available in many translations. Charles Bukowski, Bluebird. And good. So there's some strange lines on the screen. So hope, coming back to our Congress opening. To my mind, hope is life. If there's no hope, where is the life? Okay, so hope is a sort of core, is existential to life. So what do we need to do in a changing world, in changing contexts, in all sorts of things happening around us, yeah, to kind of affirm this sort of life, this life hope. Yeah? A tree hopes to grow, okay, and produce seeds. So it's not just human beings, it's all creatures, all living creatures, yeah, that are alive, yeah, with hope, yeah, with vitality. And when we lose that hope, we lose that vitality, we're in a bad place, naturally. So this is really about, what can we do while on the one hand maintaining a safe space, but also somehow finding ways to let hope and life flourish again. So thank you very much, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom, for a very moving and evocative presentation, in terms of some of the essential encounters and meanings of the psychotherapeutic situation, but also for ourselves as psychotherapists. There's been many responses and a lot of comments about such a profound poem, and also that wondering also, in terms of what you described in terms of the eggs, people became very curious about that, and some people expressed a fragility in relation to that. But one question that came up was the ideas of around deconstruction and reconstruction, in terms of discovery. And maybe you might say a few more words about that. And I'd link that to another question people ask, like, what is your vision for the future of psychotherapy?
Okay, I mean, deconstruction and reconstruction is such a huge field. Okay, I mean, maybe just the egg first. I mean, the egg is such a symbol for fragility. We use the word fragility. We use terms like sitting on eggshells as a typical experience of working with borderline trauma. Yeah? But therapists feel they're sitting on eggshells. Every movement is dangerous, is potentially leading to disaster. So I think egg is a good experience of being in that space, yeah, of being uncertainty, anxiety, yeah, sitting within that. Now, when we start thinking about deconstructing, I think it's always good to come back, yeah, to what is it? What is it here that wants to speak? What is it here that is not yet heard? Which is, typically, what gets transferred into transference, countertransference. Yeah? I mean, the object relations people say, the countertransference is a compass to guide us through the transference. So we're trying to hear what cannot yet be said, what often, the client patient isn't even conscious of. So I think when we deconstruct, I need to come back to what you were saying earlier, Barbara, how to actually sit back and receive, how to listen. and not react, take in, and let all these different elements that speak to us, that may be very fragmented at the time. How can we actually just hear this? And then let something maybe over a long time emerge out of this.
Yes.
I have described these examples. I'm not going to go into the detail. There, somebody was present for the few minutes before arrival, week on week. And after many, many months, I was able to put this into some words, my internal experience, and that shifted something. If we call this deconstruction, I don't know. Okay, so what do we mean by this? To me, that's my understanding of deconstruction, that we allow these fragments to be existent, to be present, and then see how we can connect them and
Thank you. And about
construct something more. Yeah, sorry.
And in terms of construction, perhaps your vision in terms of the future of psychotherapists and psychotherapy, given that we're confronted with a lot of challenges around disease and digitalization, what's your vision?
Well, I'm not a friend of the term artificial intelligence, because I believe in order to learning is not intelligence. Computers can learn very well, but intelligence means that we can process, that today neuroscience has taught us that emotional cognition is more effective than mental cognition. It's a higher order processing.
Yes.
Yeah? So, but in order to experience this, we need to experience ourselves in the world. And we haven't yet found ways for computers, machines to experience themselves in the world.
Yes.
That's a crucial definition. Yeah? I need to have an experience in order to grapple with the nuances. Has your computer ever apologized to you? I mean, that's the first most basic intelligence, the ability to apologize, which of course some politicians can't do, as we know. But at the same time, in terms of our future and where we are going, I am positive, because we have expanded our understanding, our knowledge. We have worked very constructively with neuroscientists and systemic sciences. I mean, there's so much happening that help us to fine-tune, to understand, to review how we work and what we do, and put it onto a more solid footing. I'm not talking about efficiency of these things, or evidence-based. That's it's all a lot of hot air in my eyes. But it's about actually going deeper into the matter and getting a better sense of what is going on.
Yes.
Yeah. And then whether this is on Zoom or I mean, I can sense a person on Zoom just as well as I can do it in a room.
Yes. And your example of what happened on the phone was really very evocative. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And a lot of compliments, and thank you. One comment, very profound. Thanks. Love you starting with Freuds Couch. No matter what, we can't bury Freud. So
we don't want to bury Freud.
No.
We have reviewed many of his theories.
Yes,
okay.
Yes. Yes.
But we don't want to bury him. I don't want to bury him.
No. And it's interesting that he's coming back in a different way, in that his scientific project that he left aside because actually he didn't have some of the what we know now about the brain to be able to correlate his findings, but it's been updated in terms of what we know about the brain. So it was quite amazing what he intuited and what he didn't know that he knew. Yeah. Well,
to my mind, even this idea that psychoanalytic psychotherapy is more frequent. If you think of the horizontal, of course that needs more containment than sitting up. Yeah. So it all makes sense, but I don't know if he was conscious of this. But he had such an intuitive approach. And so many things he wrote. Yeah, he missed a few corners here and there.
Yes, he
and
did.
Sometimes he went up the wrong tree. But on many occasions he was quite intuitive.
And also one interesting thing, a very important aspect in terms of the brain, is the whole idea of homeostasis. And homostasis actually wasn't even thought about until 16 years after his death. So, I mean, he was quite, Okay, so one comment here is that the delicate nature that you referenced early on was definitely felt throughout. Continue considering, continue constructing, Tom. So, yes.
Thank you. And thank you so much for us pairing up today. I was so delighted when I found out, when it transpired that we would be doing this together. It was such a delight. So
yes, I enjoyed it deeply too. And we just have 1 minute towards
okay.
before we end. Okay. Just one question. Interested to know more about your thinking about the use of online therapy with people who have difficulties with issues in developing intimacy.
Well, in many ways, Zoom might be easier. Actually, I have another example I didn't give you. I was sort of on my mind when I put this together. This is a woman with body dysmorphia. Okay, and quite severe body dysmorphia, and who was very anti-Zoom. So this was before the pandemic. Always rejected anything but meeting in a room. But it eventually transpired that she could only talk and explore her body dysmorphia on via screen. So that somehow made it safe enough.
Yes.
I think often there's a paradox here. And I think paradox is some of the most powerful tools we have in psychotherapy, where sometimes what seems to be that is actually this.
Yes.
So, so I think that's a good place to. So I think, so if it comes to Zoom or telephone or just stay with what happens, and particularly all our countertransference, because that will often warn us of real trouble. If I have a strong resistance to something, I stay with that, I explore it, I don't dismiss it. And I consider it, first of all, in practical terms, and then I consider it as countertransference. And that can be a very difficult place to hold that, that ambiguity, to not go for one or the other, and maintain until it becomes clearer.
Yes.
So it's not this or the other, it's many things.
Yes.
Good.
Okay, so thank you very much. And thank you everyone for your participation and all your questions.